this morning to introduce Claire Snyder, who will be giving today's seminar. She's received her BA in Public Policy Studies from Duke, a Master's of Health Science and Health Policy from Hopkins, a PhD in Health Policy and Management from the Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She is now Professor of Medicine and Oncology at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Her research focus is quality of cancer care, quality of life for cancer patients, coordination of care between primary care providers and cancer specialists. She has well over 100 publications, and she leads the PROTEUS Consortium, which is patient-reported outcomes tools, engaging users and stakeholders. And actually, she's also the past president of the International Society for Quality of Life Research. So she's a very accomplished person, and we are delighted to have her talk to us today about navigating the use of patient-reported outcomes in clinical trials, the PROTEUS Consortium.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for the opportunity to join y'all today. And the work that I'm going to be discussing today was funded by the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, and we also have unrestricted grants from Genentech and Pfizer. So to make sure that we all start out on the same page, I wanted to define what a PRO is. And a PRO is any report about the status of a patient's health that comes directly from the patient without interpretation by a clinician or anyone else. And a good way to think about what PROs measure is they're the patient's reports of how they feel, function, live their lives, and survive. And it can be helpful to think about PROs, patient-reported outcomes, I'll refer to them as PROs throughout the talk today, in the context of other types of clinical outcomes that are assessed. And this is the taxonomy proposed by the Food and Drug Administration. So patient-reported outcomes are patients' reports of their symptoms, functional status, well-being, and so on. But sometimes we also assess clinical outcomes by asking clinicians things about treatment, toxicity, and cancer, where I do my work, things like the CTC-AE, but you also have things like the New York Heart Classification. Sometimes we ask observers to report about how the patient is doing, things like seizure frequency or scar appearance. And then sometimes we assess outcomes by actually having patients perform activities, such as a treadmill test or a cognitive assessment. But for the purposes of my talk today, I'm gonna focus on PROs. And I'm not gonna be able to monitor the chat while I'm giving my talk, but if anyone has a question, Taylor or whoever, please feel free to jump in and interrupt me, because I wanna make sure I take y'all with me the whole way and no one gets lost along the way. So patient-reported outcomes, or PROs, are really valuable information for patients when they're making decisions about treatment. And this was a study that my colleague, Michael Brundage at Queen's University in Canada did, where he recruited cancer patients not making a decision about chemotherapy to serve as surrogates for cancer patients who were making decisions or could be making decisions about whether to have chemotherapy or not. And this study was done around the time when the first evidence was emerging that for early stage lung cancer, there were chemotherapy treatments that could extend life, but at the cost of toxicity and decrements to patients' quality of life. And so in this experiment, first he described what it would be like to get the chemotherapy and what the toxicity was. And he said, well, how much longer would you have to live before you'd be willing to take the chemotherapy? And then he described what the evidence was about what the survival advantage actually was and said, well, how much do you want to take chemotherapy or not, now that you know what the survival is? And then he randomized the participants into two groups. And group A saw just a minor difference in the quality of life impacts of the chemotherapy, but group B saw a pretty substantial decrease in quality of life related to the chemotherapy. And then he said, how does that change, if at all, your decision about whether to have chemotherapy? And then at the end of the exercise, he said, what was the information throughout this process that, was most helpful to you in making your decision? So this is an example of what was shown for a small impact of chemotherapy. This is the global health domain. Higher scores are better. And you can see with no additional treatment, it's only slightly better than if you had additional treatment. And then 9 months after treatment, they're back to being the same. This was an example of what was shown for a big impact on quality of life, where the scores dropped like 20 points, and then they improved somewhat after treatment, but 9 months later, quality of life remained lower than without the additional treatment. Again, but not getting the survival advantage of chemotherapy. And what he found was that the quality of life data did influence patients' decisions about whether to get chemotherapy or not, because those who were shown a large magnitude of impact were less likely to want to undertake the chemotherapy, whereas those who were shown the small impact were pretty much unchanged in their willingness to undergo the chemotherapy. And at the end, when he said what information was useful to you in making your decision, survival was, the most important factor in deciding whether they would want to have chemotherapy or not. But the quality of life and functional status measures played an equal role to the toxicity information in patients' decision-making. However, despite the fact that patients value this information, there are barriers in getting this information to the patients to make their decisions, because in a separate study that Dr. Brundage did, where he surveyed oncologists, less than half felt comfortable interpreting quality of life data from the clinical trial literature, but on the bright side, 2/3 said they were interested in improving their ability to do so. And so that brings us to the PROTEUS Consortium. PROTEUS stands for Patient-Reported Outcomes Tools, Engaging Users and Stakeholders. And our website, the PROTEUSconsortium.org, houses a lot of the information and tools and resources that I'll be describing today. The objective of the PROTEUS Consortium is to ensure that patients, clinicians, and other decision makers have high quality pro data from clinical trials to make the best decisions they can about treatment options. And our approach in doing this is to partner with the key stakeholder groups to disseminate and implement tools and guidance documents that have been developed to optimize the use of PROs in clinical trials. We were chatting about this before, but before we adopted PROTEUS as the name of our group, we wanted to make sure that he was not some horrible Greek god who ate his children. And we were really quite pleased to find that he's a very appropriate name for our group. So he's an early sea god, god of an elusive sea change, suggesting the constantly changing nature of the sea. And he can foresee the future, but you have to tame the beast in order to get him to do so. And he will shapeshift and do whatever he can to avoid it. So I think those of us who work in the clinical trial world can really relate to elusive sea change and, really trying to find out the truth, but it being challenging to get there. The adjective protean means flexible, versatile, and adaptable. And I can't imagine more appropriate adjectives for our world that we live in these days. These are the organizations with PROTEUS participants. We are delighted to have a range of representatives from patient and clinician advocacy groups, such as the American Society of Clinical Oncology and the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship. We have government and regulatory bodies, such as the US FDA and the European Medicines Organization. We have clinical trial funders like the National Cancer Institute and American Cancer Society. We have groups that actually run clinical trials like the US National Clinical Trials Network, but also networks from Australia and Europe. And then we have research and methods organizations such as the International Society for Quality of Life Research and ISPOR. You can tell that there is a cancer focus of Proteus right now. Some of the tools and resources I'll be describing were developed specifically in the cancer context, although we do think that they translate to other disease areas. And finally, we always note that participating in Proteus does not imply endorsement of any particular pro tools or guidance documents. This is the steering committee that leads Proteus. I have the privilege and pleasure of working with Dr. Brundage as co-principal investigators of this. We have a Hopkins formerly a student and now junior faculty who serves as the project scientist. And then we have clinical trial experts from the UK, Europe, Australia, and the US serving on our steering committee. The rationale for developing Proteus is that research has found that clinical trial protocols aren't always super complete when it comes to the pro components of the study. And probably as a result of that, when it comes to reporting the pro findings, the information is suboptimal. And we think this leads to the issues that the clinicians reported in Dr. Brundage's survey about not knowing how to understand the information and use it with patients. But the good news is that tools are available to improve protocol design, execution, and reporting with regard to pro endpoints. So going back to our objective of ensuring that patients, clinicians, and other decision makers have high quality pro data from clinical trials, to achieve this, you have to take what we call a SMART approach in your clinical trial. You have to specify the pro methods appropriately, measure the pros effectively, analyze the data properly, report the results clearly, all so that the findings can be translated into practice. The good news is that for every step in this clinical trial process, there are tools and resources that provide guidance for how to optimally incorporate pros in the clinical trial. So at its heart, Proteus is really an implementation and dissemination project, or as they say in Canada and other parts of the world, knowledge translation. And this is the framework that we're using to organize our efforts. At the center of the framework, you can see that knowledge is synthesized and creates tools and products. And that part has already been done. There are already tools and products that we have created over the past decade or so to guide the use of pros in clinical trials. So Proteus is really focused on the outer ring of this framework, where we're trying to identify the facilitators and barriers and adapt the tools and resources so that they can be most useful in practice. So what you can see on this slide, which serves as the roadmap for Proteus's work, at the top is the entire trajectory of the clinical trial, all the way from development through uptake of the trial findings. And what we've done is place each of the 6 core Proteus guidance documents at their relevant part along the clinical trial trajectory where you would use them to help you. And I'm going to go over each of the 6 tools individually, but we recently published a paper in the journal Clinical Trials that briefly describes all 6 tools in one place. So we call it our 6-tool, 1-paper paper. So just to go briefly through each of the tools, and I'm not going to go into any detail about all of the specific recommendations because it's actually deadly boring, although incredibly useful. But what I want to do is give you a flavor for the information that's available to you in them as well as the consistency across all the different guidance documents. So some of you might be familiar with the SPIRIT guidance for writing a clinical trial protocol generally. A group put together a specific PRO extension to address the protocol aspects related to patient-reported outcomes that should be included. And it's things like you need to make sure that you specify what your PRO-specific research question is, what the rationale is for it, and any specific PRO objectives or hypotheses, including like the specific domains. When it comes to collecting the data, you need to justify the PRO measure you selected and its psychometric performance, and describe how the data is going to be collected, how missing data is going to be minimized and addressed when it occurs. And finally, state whether PRO data will be monitored during the course of the clinical trial to inform care. The next tool in our toolbox is guidance developed by the International Society for Quality of Life Research regarding minimum standards for PRO measures used in patient-centered outcomes and comparative effectiveness research. And this tells you how to judge the different PRO measures that are out there. There are hundreds out there. And so when you're trying to decide which measure is the right one to use for your research question in your clinical trial, you need to think about what is the content and what is the measurement model? What scores is it going to produce? And is it appropriate for the population that you're aiming to study? How does the measure perform in terms of reliability and validity? And then are the scores interpretable? Do we know what the scores on these measures mean? Some logistical issues include translation availability for trials with multilingual participants and patient and investigator burden. The next tool addresses the analysis of the PRO data, and this is an effort out of Europe, the European Organization for the Research and Treatment of Cancer. And they're looking to develop international standards for analyzing cancer RCT PRO data. And in their initial work, they described a taxonomy of objectives. You know, is this study looking at PROs purely descriptively, or is it looking to make confirmatory comparisons? And are they looking to prove superiority, or are they looking at equivalence or non-inferiority? And do they expect to see improvement or worsening, or the proportion of responders at a particular point in time? And then for each of the approaches, SysAQual will recommend statistical methods as well as providing guidance for dealing with missing PRO data. And SysAQual is continuing through a new 4-year project called SysAQual IMI. So these initial recommendations will be built out even further. Once the trial is over and it comes to reporting the findings, there's a Consort PRO extension. So similar to the Consort recommendations for reporting randomized controlled trials in general, there's a specific PRO extension for the PRO aspects. And these are the key things that we think are important to include in your clinical trial report. You know, was the PRO a primary or secondary outcome? Was the PRO hypothesis and specific domain stated? Was the instrument's validity and reliability justified? How were the data collected? How were missing data dealt with? And then in the discussion, really trying to put the PRO findings in clinical context and discuss any particular limitations. A specific aspect of reporting PRO data is how to graphically display them so that they can be understood and used in practice. And so there's specific guidance just on the graphic display point. And this is how we recommend presenting data to patients in things like educational materials or decision aids. And so what we recommend is that on some PRO measures, higher scores are better, and on some higher scores are worse. So we recommend really clear labeling to make that obvious to the user. We also recommend that if you know what descriptive labels go with specific numbers or scores, that those be included on the y-axis. For clinicians and researchers, we recommend additional statistical data that patients and our research have said they don't want and they find confusing. So we always recommend including confidence limits. In this case, we also provide an overall p-value. And then in addition, we've noted with cross marks scores that are clinically important between groups, because statistical significance doesn't necessarily mean does not mean clinical importance. And all of this needs to be described in the legend. And then on the final part of this is a clinician's user's guide. So this is a checklist for the clinicians who might have participated in Dr. Brendage's early survey who said, we don't know how to use the information reported. And so what we tell clinicians to look for is the same information that we tell the research to report. So, you know, was there a hypothesis stated? Were the pro measures described? And is the content appropriate? Were these the right pro measures that would expect to perform psychometrically? What's the internal validity? And were the results put into clinical context so I can judge whether the results apply to my patient? So while PROTEUS has identified those 6 core tools that we focus our research on, we also recognize that there are other tools and guidance documents out there, and we want to take advantage of all of the information that's available to help researchers use PROs in clinical trials. So one project we did in particular was to look at all the different guidance documents that were out there about how to select a pro measure. So for the purposes of PROTEUS, we focus on the ISOCOL minimum standards, but these other documents here, some from the FDA, some from the European Medicines Agency, all provide very consistent information in terms of what to think about when selecting a pro measure. And our point in PROTEUS isn't so much you have to follow these specific guidelines, but it's that you should take a systematic and thoughtful approach to the pro part of your study so that you can really provide valuable information to patients and clinicians. And if you're doing an FDA study, then you should probably follow the FDA guidance instead of the ISOCOL minimum standards. But as is shown here, the recommendations are very consistent. Another project PROTEUS undertook based on input from our consortium was to provide guidance for what key information to put in grant applications about the pro aspects of a study. So we all know that protocols can be as long as they want to be, but grant applications have very strict page limits. So we organized our recommendations of information to include in 3 categories. So the first category is information that should always be covered in the grant application. And it assumes just 1 paragraph of space is available. And in the paper, we provide like example text to prove that it can be done in 1 paragraph. The second category of information is what you should include if the pro is a primary endpoint. So if the pro is a primary endpoint, you should be spending some additional time describing time and space, describing, you know, your pro measure. So that's additional information for that case. And then the third category is information to cover in your grant application if space allows. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, all of this information is available on our website at theproteusconsortium.org. And we're actually in the midst of completely redeveloping and redesigning our website. So what the pictures I'm showing here of our website aren't going to look exactly what they're going to look like when you go to our website a month or two from now, but all of the information will still be there and hopefully even easier to find. So if, for example, you clicked on tools and resources for using PROS in clinical trials, it would take you to this page that outlines the different steps in the process. And so you could, for example, click on writing PRO protocols. And if you did that, you would get a brief description of what Spirit Pro is and a link to the paper, as well as a checklist for summarizing the recommendations from Spirit Pro and videos or web tutorials. So if you clicked on a checklist, you would get something that looked like this, that really distills down what are the key things you need to make sure are in your protocol. If you click on, for example, the overview video, you'll get Doctors Melanie Calvert and Madeline King providing a web tutorial about Spirit Pro and the recommendations it has. And in fact, we have on our website a whole suite of web tutorials. So at the very top here, we have just very basic introductions to PROS and PROTEUS, and then a talk that goes through each of the 6 core tools at a very high level. And then for each of the 6 tools, we have 2 web tutorials. One is just an overview of the recommendations. So at the level of someone who might be like reviewing a paper or reviewing a grant application, but not actually having to apply the recommendations. And then we also have web tutorials that are more in-depth and detailed for those, you know, the statisticians who might need to actually apply the findings and so on. For those who don't like web tutorials, we also have a written handbook that basically has the same information as the web tutorials, but it allows you to look at the information in written form. So you can go to the hyperlinked table of contents and figure out what part you want to look at, and then go directly to the relevant information in the handbook. But we've tried to make it very easy on the eyes and user-friendly. So the last thing I want to mention before we get to our discussion is that I've spent all of my talk today discussing the use of PROS in clinical trials. And that was, in fact, what PROTEUS was initially focused on doing. But PROS can also be used in clinical practice. I don't know how many of y'all are familiar with this, but sometimes patients are asked to complete questionnaires about their symptoms, functioning, or well-being, and their particular information is fed back to their clinical team the same way lab results or imaging studies are, to help their clinicians monitor how they're doing and manage their care. And so more recently, we've kind of started describing PROTEUS as PROTEUS trials and PROTEUS practice. They're a completely different set of guidance documents and tools for the use of PROS in clinical practice. So we're developing a whole parallel stream focused specifically on the practice application of the PRO data. And as a result of that, we've expanded our consortium to include health systems and other stakeholders who are focused on the use of PROS in practice. So just in closing, I'm showing you our new and updated PROTEUS logo, and our website will soon be up and running to match that. But I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions and discussions, and I look forward to hearing from you. So I'll stop sharing so that I can see everyone.
So I would just say to everyone, if you have questions, either raise your hand or put something in the chat or just interrupt me. Anyway, so I will start, I think, with a question for Claire. Many years ago, Al Wu and I and other people in the SOCA network developed a tool to evaluate quality of life among patients with CMV retinitis who were undergoing treatment. And this was before the NEI VFQ was developed. And we found, quite to our delight, that it was responsive to changes in acuity. But we also found that there was an enormous spread of scores in the quality of life instrument across the same acuity. That patients with 20/20 would say they were miserable, and patients with 20/80 would say they were perfectly happy. And so I guess one of the questions is, recognizing that this will average out, I guess, in large populations, what do we know on these measures about their reliability, their ability? If you do the same test a day apart, how good are they in terms of that, since there's obviously a huge subjective component?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And indeed, people have very different valuations about their quality of life, even when they have the same measurable level of function, which is why it is so important to measure the patient perspective. So if you think about this, there could be very logical reasons why you would have someone who would have the same visual acuity, but very different quality of life impact on it. So if you had someone who, and I'm sorry, I don't know the specific implications of CMV. So I'm going to talk about another eye disease I do know about, which is macular degeneration. So if you have someone who really likes to read and do needlepoint, and they have lost their central vision, it's going to make a much bigger impact on them than someone where their life and hobbies and their job doesn't rely on central vision nearly enough. Maybe they talk on the phone for a living or give lectures or whatever, and you can get by, without your central vision. So, just because you see a big spread doesn't mean that the data aren't reliable or that the data aren't valuable. What it is actually showing is that the data are valuable. Because it tells you a different perspective than the visual acuity does. In terms of reliability, however, that is an incredibly important point when evaluating measures, and it's part of the ISOQOL minimum standards, and it's part of all the other guidance documents that we looked at, because you do want to have a feeling that when you see changes or differences, what you're seeing is real. And so these measures should meet minimum standards of reliability as specified in the guidance document. That being said, there's always going to be noise and error, as there are in any measure.
So Janet, you have a question.
Good morning. Let's see if I can get in my camera. I don't know where it is. Anyway, very good seminar. I really appreciated it. I work a lot in asthma and respiratory research, and we have a lot of pros that we use, like ACT and ASUI. And we've done a lot of work with trying to kind of validate them in different populations. And I really appreciate this host of resources you've opened my eyes up to, but there are a couple of questions. One is, so there's like this anchor-based method versus the distributional method. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that, where in the distributional, it's just based on the distribution, and somehow a half a standard deviation is the seems to be the gold standard, or relating it to clinical outcomes with anchor-based methods. And then one, if you have any thoughts about what's the best way to do that. And second, and I don't mean to seem cynical, but sometimes I feel like it's all, catch-22, that, okay, now I'm trying to validate this patient-reported outcome, but I'm really going back to the clinical outcomes that I think are important. And I sometimes wonder about that. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so you brought up several important points and points that are challenging in the pro world in terms of determining what is an important change or what is an important difference. And then if you want to make it really hard on yourself, trying to figure out what the minimally important change or minimally important difference is. What is the lowest number that really, represents a change that is meaningful to a patient? And this is something that our community has really engaged with for many years and tried to develop methods to address. And you mentioned two that are used. One is using an external anchor, such as, patients with Karnofsky of 90 generally have quality of life around here, whereas people who have Karnofsky of 80 generally have quality of life here. So if we think the difference between 90 and 80 is important on Karnofsky, then the difference in those scores on average is important. Another way to do that is just to look at the distribution of the data. I'm just going over what you said for those who might not have engaged with this fun endeavor as much as you have. And that's to look at the distribution of the data and whether by truth or by accident, what has been found is that generally a difference of half a standard deviation matches pretty well with what an important difference is on other measures. Now, if you look at the guidance documents, most of them recommend an anchor-based approach for determining a minimally important difference. But the half a standard deviation serves as a convenient backup if you don't have anchor-based evidence for your measure. But depending, if you want it in your FDA label, I think you're gonna have a hard time using distribution-based measures. But if you wanna just publish your paper and say, we think the difference we found is important, then you can cite the half a standard deviation papers. That's how it plays out in practicality. I think it's something that we'll get better at. On the other hand, I feel like this is an area where pros hold ourselves and are being held to a higher standard, because there are lots of measures out there, quote, clinical, hard, objective measures where we don't know what a minimally important difference is. What's a minimally important difference in survival? It's not a day. If it's pancreatic cancer, 3 months is a huge thing. But if it's, something else, then 3 months is, a drop in the bucket and unimportant. So, it's a methodologic issue, and our guidance documents do provide resources about that issue, but it is a challenge. So thank you for the question. Did I help at all?
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Claire. That was an excellent presentation, and it's good to know about all of these tools. I serve on a lot of data monitoring committees, especially in oncology. These are industry trials, and I wrote a book. But besides that, the way it works, we're given reams and reams of data, most of which are not necessary. Everybody talks about that, but what really happens in the room when we meet is the physician members know how to separate adverse events from the disease process and signal from noise, and what to expect from this drug class. And actually, you would think that's not good, but it works. I have not witnessed any serious omissions from carrying out meetings in this way. So now PROs are going to be in protocols. So I can't believe the first time that they appear, the physicians, the oncologists I work with are going to say, hey, we've got a look at these PROs. This is very important. And somehow the sponsor needs to tell the DMC, you've got to look at these PROs, and the DMC members have to say, we have concerns about these PROs. You sponsor need to look at this. I think it's going to be a lot of work to bring this about. And what are your ideas about that?
Yeah, so I think that's a great point and a really interesting perspective you bring from your data monitoring committees. I can say that in my career, which I've actually been doing pro research since 1995, so that's 27 years, that there has been a huge move towards increased focus on patient-reported outcomes. You know, I used to knock on my clinical colleagues' doors and be like, you know, have you thought about doing this? And now they're beating down my doors and say, can you help me do this? And I think in the past decade alone, there has been this elusive sea change, you know, with the patient advocacy movement really becoming front and center in research, and the creation of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, which has as its, you know, fundamental focus to do research that matters to patients and to ask patients what outcomes matter to them. And so that has been, you know, part of a larger patient engagement effort that I would argue is potentially even further along in other countries like in the UK. And so is only going to get more involved here. So I think there's definitely been a change in my career, and there, especially in the past decade, with the focus on patient-centered research and patient-centered outcomes, pros are just going to be playing a more and more prominent role.
Good. That's encouraging.
Anyone else? Questions?
Could I follow up?
Sure.
I just wanted to ask Clara, and I don't mean to be cynical, but it does seem to me
okay.
when I'm working on these papers to, you know, validate things, you know, so we're looking to see if they had an asthma exacerbation where they went to the hospital to see if our pro reflects those kind of things that are medical events that we might usually have as an outcome. So it seems like the only way we think they're good is if they reflect our medical background, and it all seems a little bit circular to me.
Yeah, so it's not quite circular, and it's complementary. And so if the medical things and the pros had a correlation of 1, right, then they would be completely redundant and useless. But just as I think it was Dr. Herson mentioned at the beginning, it was either Dr. Herson or Dr. Jabs, the pros and in their case, visual acuity, you know, could be quite different. And so there's a happy medium where your clinical things have to be correlated enough with the pros, but not too much with the pros, so that you're getting unique information. But I can assure you that the pros are providing unique information. And actually, we have a paper under review right now that we're calling informally. It's not the actual title of the paper, but we're calling it Pros Greatest Hits. And so, and this particular paper focuses on oncology, but we'll be doing a new paper in non-oncology. And these are PROTEUS initiatives. And so for the oncology one, we've taken like different interventions like surgery, radiation, systemic treatment. We've taken different parts of the continuum of care from treatment to palliation to survivorship, and looked at examples where the PROs, where we use these illustrative examples of how the PROs provide unique and valuable information. And we actually describe the impacts on things like guidelines and coverage and clinical practice. So, the PROs do add value and they do provide unique information. And just because, you have to correlate them with, some other measure, it doesn't mean that it's redundant unless the correlation is so high, in which case it would be. So I hope that helps you I hope that makes you feel better about what you're doing, and that there's a quote I use in a different talk, and it's from Atul Gawande's book about his father's journey, dying of cancer, and helping him through that. And he says in this quote, and I don't have it in front of me, but I'm paraphrasing, they kept on seeing these scary things on the X-ray, but there was no difference in how his father was, feeling, functioning, and living his life. And so they decided to ignore, the images and focus on his lived experience and, deciding how to manage his care. So it's not that the X-rays were wrong. It's just that they don't tell you the whole story.
Thank you. That is helpful.
Just to follow up on that, it seems to me that cancer particularly is the one where these are often most obvious, particularly in the older era, when I trained of sort of brutal chemotherapy instead of our more modern era, where you might add lifespan. It might be a limited amount, but at the cost of making the patient feel absolutely miserable for the rest of their life. And so I think it gets harder in some of the other disciplines than in cancer, where the side effects may be less dramatic. And we look at the PROs and we look at the objective measures, and they seem to run reasonably parallel. I certainly agree in cancer, it's very obvious the importance of PROs in evaluation of treatment regimens. That's my 2 cents worth.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm not going to sit here and say PROs belong in every study always. And that is actually one of the key recommendations of PROTEUS is, if you're going to include PROs, if you're going to invest the clinical trial resources and the patient time, then you should have a rationale for what you're measuring, why you're measuring it, and what you expect to see. The worst case, I think, is when people mindlessly throw in a PRO measure. They go through the process of collecting the data, but they don't do a very good job because no one's paying that much attention. But you still have patients who are, filling out the questionnaires and thinking they're contributing to science and stuff. And then, a huge number of PRO studies never get published. And so, there's a research waste argument there, and there's an ethics argument there. And so we want to make sure that when PROs are done, that they're done right and they're done well, so they provide valuable information. So I think that cancer is a great example, as you've described, but, there are tons of other areas: mental health, pain, neurology, you think about Parkinson's or the eye conditions, but, not necessarily flu. So there should be a rationale, there should be a reason, and the data should be, produced in a way that they serve a purpose and then are published so they can actually serve that purpose. So that's what PROTEUS is about.
Well, this has been just a terrific talk. I think it's been really, I've certainly learned an awful lot. I'm sure many of the rest of us, or all of the rest of us have. We appreciate your speaking to us. It's really been great. Oh, we have claps, not a question, but claps in the background. And I think we want to thank you all for really a terrific seminar.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity, and happy to follow up with anyone who has questions. So thank you.
All right. So long.